New York remembers the Empire State Building the way a myth remembers its crown, not as stone and steel, but as a single vertical sentence, tall, final, unquestionable. In the popular imagination, it arrives already victorious. And then cinema seals the legend. King Kong clinging to the pinnacle, planes circling like angry insects, the skyline beneath him like a sea that cannot swallow what rises above it. A spectacle, yes, but also a coronation. The building becomes more than architecture. It becomes proof. Proof that a city can always build higher than fear, higher than doubt, higher than gravity itself. Now glitch. Cut away from the roaring orchestra and the heroic framing. Cut to the year 1931, to a morning that feels like a held breath. The same tower stands in the same city, but the mood is different. The streets below are not cheering, they are counting. Counting coins, counting days, counting losses. The Great Depression has already tightened its grip, turning confidence into caution and ambition into a kind of trembling insistence. The building is there, enormous, immaculate, almost insolently new, and yet it looks lonely. Not triumphant, isolated, like a lighthouse built for ships that will not come. And this is where the story turns cruelly honest, because the people who lived with this tower in real time did not always call it empire. They gave it a nickname that sounds like laughter until you hear the hunger inside it. The empty state building. Not a compliment, an accusation. Not awe, disbelief. How could the tallest building in the world feel like a vacancy sign? How could a monument meant to embody prosperity become a standing reminder of absence, empty floors, empty promises, empty wallets? Here is the paradox at the heart of this episode. A building designed to symbolize abundance was born into scarcity. Its height promised dominance, its early years delivered embarrassment. For a long stretch of time, long enough to bruise reputations and shake faith, the building was not a financial miracle. It was a very expensive question mark in the sky. Picture the dedication. The president switches on the lights from far away, and New York receives the gesture like a national ritual technology, as theater, optimism staged as electricity. The papers can frame it as a clean line drawn through uncertainty. We are still building, we are still rising. Yet even that ceremony carries a quiet irony, because a button can turn on lights, but it cannot turn on demand. It cannot summon tenants out of a shattered economy. It cannot force money to move when fear has frozen it in place. So ask the question the skyline itself seemed to ask back then every night when too many windows stayed dark. Why would anyone build the world's tallest office tower at the exact moment offices were becoming luxuries? Why, in a city learning the language of layoffs and breadlines, would powerful men wager fortunes on a symbol? Was it courage or was it ego wearing a mask of courage? And if it was ego, whose ego? What kind of hunger does a rich man have that cannot be fed by profit, only by height? Because beneath the polished limestone and Art Deco bravado, beneath the postcards and the later nostalgia, the Empire State Building begins as something far more human and far more unsettling. A race. Not a race to shelter people. Not a race to solve a civic problem. A race to win an argument in the sky. A contest of names, pride, and measurable dominance carried out with blueprints instead of fists. And that is the hook we must hold on to before the story expands. The building we inherited as a symbol of resilience did not start as a communal act of hope. It started as a daring claim, look what I can do. Look how high I can go. Look how small you become when I stand next to you. Later, history will wrap the tower in nobler meanings. New York toughness, American endurance, the romance of the skyline. Those meanings are not false, but they are not the whole truth either. Because this victory in its earliest years felt strangely hollow like applause in an empty theater. To understand why the Empire State Building would rise at the very moment the economy was falling, you have to step into a particular room in New York history, a room where ambition had the temperature of fever, and where men measured themselves the way children measure shadows, by how far they could stretch across the ground. This was not, at first, a story about tenants and rent rolls. It was a story about stature, about whose name would be written highest against the sky. And in that room sat a man who did not merely want a skyscraper. He wanted a verdict. John J. Raskob, powerful, wealthy, and sharpened by corporate combat, looked at the skyline the way a general looks at terrain, not as a shared cityscape, but as a battlefield of symbols. Nearby, another tower had already begun to taunt the city with Art Deco confidence, the Chrysler Building, a steel and chrome declaration that Walter Chrysler could turn automobile glory into architectural dominance. And to men like Raskob, dominance was not something you felt. It was something you proved in public. So the goal was simple, almost embarrassingly human: build higher than the other man. Even if it was only by a little, even if it made no practical sense, even if it risked everything. Because in these contests, the point is never enough. The point is more. There is a moment, part anecdote, part legend, that captures this obsession perfectly. Raskob stands a pencil upright on a desk as if the pencil were already a tower, and asks the question that sounds like innovation but is really pure challenge. How tall can you make it without it collapsing? The pencil becomes a metaphor, and the metaphor becomes a mandate. Make it stand. Make it taller than anything else. Make it so tall that no one can ignore it. In that single gesture, you can almost see the psychology of the era. The belief that engineering could outmuscle uncertainty, that concrete could argue with fate, that height itself could be a form of immortality. And this is where the tragedy begins to gather. Because while ego was planning its victory, history was preparing its counterpunch. The stock market crash of 1929 had already cracked the illusion of endless growth. Businesses were shrinking, families were breaking, jobs were evaporating. Yet the project surged forward anyway, as if speed could outrun reality. And why? Because once the wager had been made, slowing down would look like fear. And fear, in this particular game, was the only unacceptable loss. There is something profoundly modern about that, this idea that public confidence must be maintained even when private certainty is gone. The Empire State Building was conceived in an atmosphere where reputation mattered like oxygen. These men were not only building a tower, they were building a narrative about themselves. Decisive, unstoppable, larger than the moment. But a narrative cannot pay interest, and steel does not care about pride. The deeper you look, the clearer it becomes. The Empire State Building was never just an office building project. It was a crown built in a storm. A monument planned as if the sun would always return on schedule. A gamble dressed as inevitability. Imagine signing contracts while headlines screamed panic. Imagine ordering mountains of material while banks tightened their fists. Imagine insisting on the tallest building in the world while the world was learning new words for loss. That is the context, a collision between the last burst of roaring 20s bravado and the first cold breath of depression reality. In hindsight, it seems impossible. In the moment, to the men who lived by momentum, it probably felt necessary. Because when you have built your identity on being the man who wins, you cannot simply stop playing. So the race continued, the height escalated, the ambition sharpened into obsession. And somewhere beneath those decisions, a darker truth was already forming. If the building was going to survive financially, it would have to be finished fast, faster than the market could collapse beneath it, faster than creditors could lose patience, faster than public mood could turn from awe to ridicule. The contest in the sky had quietly become a contest against time, and when time becomes your enemy, the cost is usually paid by the people who cannot afford to argue. In the next part, we leave the boardrooms and step onto the beams, where speed becomes a religion, where men walk above the city with nothing but air beneath them, and where the Empire's victory is built not only with steel, but with risk, hunger, and bodies that the headlines will never name. Once the wager was placed and the skyline was chosen as the scoreboard, the Empire State Building stopped being a construction project and became a countdown. Not a poetic countdown, an economic one. The kind that ticks inside a man's chest when he realizes he is building a cathedral of offices while the world is quietly deciding it can no longer afford prayer. Speed, suddenly was not a virtue. It was survival. Because if the building could be completed quickly enough, it could begin earning quickly enough, and maybe, just maybe, it could outrun the collapse happening at street level. That was the logic. It was brutal, almost simple, finish first, rent first, breathe later. So the work began with a tempo that bordered on insanity. The schedule did not merely demand efficiency, it demanded a kind of organized recklessness, a pace of roughly 4 to 5 floors a week, week after week, as if the structure were being pulled upward by a rope tied to panic itself. But speed in a skyscraper is not like speed on a road. You cannot rush height without making height rush you back. Every added floor multiplies the danger, complicates the choreography, increases the distance between a man and the ground that forgives nothing. And still, the work surged upward. Steel arrived like an endless river. Rivets snapped into place with the sharp percussion of industry. The air filled with metallic clatter, hammer strikes, shouted signals, the groan of cranes, the whistle of wind funneling between rising frames. It was a symphony, if you want to romanticize it. It was also a factory in the sky, a place where the product was not only a building, but the illusion that control still existed in a world slipping out of control. And then you meet the men who made this illusion physical, not the men in suits. The men in boots, the workers whom the city would later mythologize as if they were born without fear, the skyboys. Immigrants, laborers, men whose names rarely survive in official retellings, even though their bodies did the most intimate work with gravity. Among them were Mohawk ironworkers, famous for their presence on the steel of New York. Men who moved along beams with a familiarity that looked like courage from far away and like necessity up close. The truth is rarely neat. Their skill was real, their steadiness extraordinary. But the reason they accepted such heights was not always romance, not always pride. Often it was the oldest reason in history, because there was work here and there wasn't work elsewhere. Now look down, really look. The streets below were filled with men who would have traded places instantly. Thousands out of work, families collapsing under rent they could not pay. Soup lines, shame, hunger. In that world, a paycheck was not merely money, it was dignity, heat, survival, and that is how danger becomes negotiable. That is how a man convinces himself that a thin strip of steel is wide enough. That is how he steps out over open air and tells his legs not to shake, because he cannot afford shaking. On the ground, people were dying slowly. Up here, people could die quickly. Either way, the era was unforgiving. So when one man fell, or when one man couldn't come back the next day, there were others ready to take his spot, not because they lacked empathy, but because desperation does not wait politely for grief to finish speaking. It is a harsh sentence, but history keeps writing it. In a crash, human life becomes cheaper than the materials used to build the monument. You have seen the photograph. Almost everyone has, even if they don't remember its title at first. A row of men sitting on a steel beam, legs dangling over the void, calmly eating lunch as if the sky were just another sidewalk. Lunch atop a skyscraper. In popular culture, it reads as swagger, as proof that the human spirit can laugh at height. But if you hold the image longer, if you refuse to let it remain a postcard, you start to feel what it truly contains. Not just courage, but coercion. Not a gun-to-the-head coercion. The quieter kind. The kind that says, eat quickly. Work resumes in 10 minutes. Don't drop anything. Don't slip. Don't die. Someone else wants your job. The men are relaxed, because they must be. Panic would only make them more likely to fall. That calm is not a natural state, it is a technique, a survival method, a discipline learned in a time when weakness was expensive. And the wind, people forget the wind. On the street, wind is an inconvenience. Up here, it becomes a living force with intent. It tugs at clothing, steals heat, shifts your balance by inches that feel like miles. At these heights, you are never simply standing. You are negotiating constantly with an invisible opponent. The beam under your feet is not a place, it is a question. Do you trust your body today? Do you trust the man beside you? Do you trust the bolt that was tightened in a hurry because the schedule demanded it? The most unsettling part is that the project's brilliance, its coordination, its engineering mastery, its speed, could not exist without this human element of risk. Efficiency in skyscraper building is not just logistics. It is the compression of time. And time, when compressed, squeezes people first. The Empire State Building rose so quickly that it felt like a magic trick to the public. But there was no magic. There was only labor layered, relentless, under pressure. There was only the quiet fact that every record has a hidden cost, and the cost is often paid by those least able to refuse. Still, the building climbed. Day after day, its frame sharpened into the sky. The city watched, torn between awe and resentment, as if the tower were both a promise and a provocation. Because what does it mean to build an empire when so many can't afford dinner? What does it mean to raise a symbol of wealth in the middle of widespread loss? For some, it looked like hope, a sign that New York was still alive, still capable, still moving. For others, it looked like arrogance, a needle piercing the clouds while the streets bled. And perhaps the truth was both. That is what makes it history, instead of propaganda, this refusal to be one clean emotion. By the time the building neared completion, the victory was already beginning to taste strange. The tower had achieved what it set out to achieve. It was taller. It was undeniable. It had won the race of men. But a taller building does not automatically become a fuller building. Height can be conquered in months. Confidence cannot. And the city was about to teach the Empire State Building its first hard lesson. You can finish the monument and still fail to fill it. The day a skyscraper opens is supposed to feel like a final chord brass. Applause, certainty. For the Empire State Building, the opening arrived with all the correct ingredients for a triumph. A fixed date, a national spotlight, a president involved, a city that loves spectacle, and a tower that had already won the race simply by existing higher than everything else. On paper, it was destiny. In photographs, it was modernity. In headlines, it was America refusing to fold. The building was dedicated, the lights were turned on, and the story was told the way powerful people prefer stories to be told. Clean, confident, inevitable. But history is rarely polite enough to match the script, because beneath the ceremony was a silence so large you could almost hear it echo between the walls. There were not enough tenants, not enough money, not enough confidence, not enough life to justify the scale of what had been built. The Empire State Building, newly crowned and impossibly tall, stood there like a banquet hall after the guests have decided not to come. It's important to understand what an office tower actually is when you strip away the romance of height. It is not a monument in the ancient sense. It is a machine that converts location into rent, prestige into leases, and foot traffic into revenue. And in 1931, the machine had been switched on in a city where the fuel business expansion, corporate optimism, easy credit had suddenly become scarce. Companies were not hiring, they were cutting. They were not upgrading to glamorous new addresses. They were downsizing, consolidating, surviving. So the building's very genius became its first curse. It was too large, too ambitious, too expensive for the moment it had been born into. And so, almost immediately, the nickname began to feel less like gossip and more like diagnosis. The empty state building. It wasn't just that some floors were vacant. It was that the emptiness became the building's personality. People judged it not by how high it reached, but by how dark it looked at night. A skyscraper is supposed to glow thousands of tiny squares of light, each one proof that someone is inside, working, living, paying. Darkness in a building like this reads as failure. And the darkness spread. So management tried something that sounds absurd until you remember how much money was on the line. They turned on lights in empty offices to create the illusion of occupancy. Think about that, an architectural masterpiece reduced to stagecraft. A tower performing success for the city, like a smiling host hiding an empty dining room behind a closed door. It was a kind of corporate makeup applied nightly to conceal the bruises. From a distance, the building could look alive. Up close, it was painfully quiet. This is where the victory becomes hollow in the most human way. The men who built the tower had won the visible contest, height, glory, headlines. But the real contest, the one that decides whether a building lives or dies, was invisible. Cash flow, leases, sustained demand. And that contest does not care about pride. It does not care about how daring the blueprint was. It does not care that the steelworkers walked above the clouds. The economy was simply not in the mood to admire. It was in the mood to endure. And When endurance becomes the city's primary emotion, skyscrapers take on a different meaning. They stop looking like ladders to the future. They start looking like mirrors reflecting harshly what people cannot afford anymore. In that atmosphere, the Empire State Building became more than a real estate problem. It became a symbol that could be read in two completely different ways, depending on what you had lost. For some, the tower was hope. If we can build this, we can rebuild everything. For others, it was insult. Look at what they can spend while we are starving. A tall building has no single moral. It becomes whatever the crowd needs it to be. And in the early 1930 seconds, the crowd needed something to blame, something to laugh at, something to resent, something to fear. Then another darkness arrived, one that did not come from empty offices, but from empty hearts. The building's height, its fame, its accessibility, turned it into a magnet not only for tourists and dreamers, but also for the desperate. In an era when many people felt their lives shrinking, the tallest structure in the city began to attract those who saw height not as possibility, but as exit. It is a grim truth, and it must be handled with respect. The Empire State Building became associated with suicides in its early years, enough that it entered public consciousness as a place where despair could take a final, dramatic form. The tower, meant to embody American ascent, was forced to carry another meaning, American collapse, made personal. And notice the cruel symmetry. A building created by ego becomes for some a stage for heartbreak. A monument designed to prove power becomes a place where powerlessness is acted out in the most irreversible way. That is the sort of irony history loves, not because it is funny, but because it is merciless. Yet, even here, the building did not break. It did what New York structures are built to do. It absorbed, meaning the way stone absorbs weather. It endured ridicule. It endured vacancy. It endured being called a failure to its face every time someone repeated that nickname. And still, it stood there, sharp against the sky, as if refusing to apologize for existing. By the mid-1940 seconds, the building had already lived through humiliation and gloom. But its next test would not come from the economy or from public mood. It would come from the air itself, literally from above on a morning when the city disappeared into fog, and a military aircraft, lost and blind, went searching for a runway and found a wall of steel instead. On the morning of the 28th of July, 1945, New York wore a disguise. Fog, thick, stubborn, almost theatrical, settled over the city and erased distance. Landmarks softened into ghosts. The skyline, normally so proud and legible, became a blurred rumor. It was the kind of weather that makes a city feel smaller, as if buildings themselves are holding their breath. And in that reduced visibility, the Empire State Building stopped being an icon and returned briefly to what it truly was, a mass of steel and stone occupying a specific piece of air. A place you could hit above the fog line, a U, as Army B-25 bomber moved through the morning like a heavy thought. It wasn't an enemy aircraft. There was no attack, no alarm, no wartime drama in the cinematic sense. It was a tragic chain of ordinary decisions, made extraordinary by weather and speed. The plane had become disoriented, the pilot searching for the right path through an atmosphere that offered no clear edges. In good visibility, the city tells you where you are. In fog, it lies. In fog, a river becomes a street becomes a shadow becomes nothing at all. And then the nothing suddenly becomes a building. The moment of impact is difficult to imagine precisely because of how wrong it feels. We are comfortable with the idea that buildings are fixed and planes are moving, that the moving object yields to the immovable one. But when the moving object carries fuel, velocity, and mass, the immovable one is forced to participate. The B-25 slammed into the Empire State Building around the 79th floor, tearing into the structure with a violence that turned architecture into debris. One engine shot through the building and out the other side, falling toward the streets below. Another engine and parts of the aircraft collapsed into the interior, a brutal intrusion into offices that were never built to receive the sky like this. And then came the fire, the element that makes even the strongest structures suddenly feel fragile. Aviation fuel spilled, ignited, and moved the way fire always moves. Intelligently, hungrily, toward oxygen, toward shafts, toward pathways designed for human convenience. It poured into elevator systems and service corridors, turning vertical infrastructure into a furnace. The building's internal organs, the shafts and channels, meant to make the tower function, became conduits for catastrophe. In an instant, the Empire State Building was no longer merely a tall structure. It was a burning one. Yet even in this, the tower revealed a grim kind of competence. It did not fold. It did not collapse. It did not become the spectacle the world might expect when a plane collides with a skyscraper. The damage was severe, the scene horrifying, but the building stayed standing, wounded, smoking, but stubbornly intact. It was as if the structure itself refused to grant the fog the final word. And inside this catastrophe, inside this screaming metal and the heat history, hid something almost impossible. A survival story so improbable it sounds like a parable about luck. Her name was Betty Lou Oliver, an elevator operator, a young woman whose job was usually defined by routine. Open doors, close doors, move people up and down a tower that had become a part of the city's bloodstream. On that day, routine was destroyed. In the chaos after the impact, the elevator systems were compromised. Cables were damaged. Structural force and fire turned the elevator shaft into a vertical trap. Betty Lou Oliver was inside an elevator when the catastrophe reached it, when the mechanisms failed and the car began to fall. Imagine the sensation, not simply descending, but dropping, the stomach lurch of gravity, unspooling without restraint. A plunge of dozens of stories, an amount of distance that your mind cannot easily convert into feeling until you remember what a single floor looks like when you stand beneath it and tilt your head up. Now multiply. Now let it fall. The elevator plunged an astonishing distance, roughly 75 floors, a fall that, by any ordinary logic, should have been fatal. And yet she lived, not uninjured, not untouched, but alive. The reason reads like the kind of detail that makes you believe fate has preferences. The cables, severed and tangled, coiled beneath the elevator car, forming a crude, accidental spring. Combined with air pressure effects in the shaft, that coil softened the final impact enough to spare her life. The building, in other words, tried to kill her, and then, through the physics of its own broken machinery, it saved her. This is why the story stays with people. Not because it is neat, but because it is the opposite, chaotic, unfair, miraculous in a way that feels almost offensive to probability. A woman survives what should not be survivable. A building absorbs what should have broken it. The fog hides the city, and the city refuses to disappear. And notice what this event does to the meaning of the Empire State Building. Earlier, the tower's drama was economic vacancy, ridicule, the humiliation of emptiness. Now the drama becomes physical impact, fire, survival. This is not about whether the building can earn enough rent. This is about whether it can endure the impossible. And when it does, when it stands after being struck by a military aircraft, it acquires a new kind of authority. Not the authority of ego, the authority of resilience, because a tower that simply rises is impressive. But a tower that is tested and remains becomes mythic. It becomes the kind of object people point to when they need proof that their city can take a hit, that it can be scarred and still function, that it can burn and still stand. By the time the smoke cleared and the headlines moved on, the Empire State Building had already taught New York a lesson it never really stops learning. A symbol can be famous long before it is profitable. A skyline can celebrate you while your spreadsheets quietly accuse you. And for this tower so often spoken of as if it sprang fully formed into legend, the truth is slower, less glamorous, more human. It took time for the Empire State Building to become what people now assume it always was. It took time for the city to grow back into it. It took time for the economy to remember how to expand. It took time for the building's victory to stop feeling like a dare and start functioning like a sustainable fact. In its early life, the building had height without fullness and empty grandeur. It stood there with the confidence of a champion and the bank account of a gambler. And yet, the tower did something that separates mere monuments from lasting icons. It endured being misunderstood. It endured being mocked. It endured being called hollow. It endured the quiet embarrassment of lit windows with no one behind them. It endured the sense that it had arrived in the wrong era, like a grand piano delivered to a home that has lost electricity. Then came the gradual shift, not a cinematic turnaround, not a single heroic moment, but the slow return of normal economic breath. The city began to hire again. Companies began to expand again. Foot traffic returned. Confidence crept back into the bloodstream of Manhattan. And as that happened, the Empire State Building stopped being simply a trophy and began to become, finally, what it was engineered to be, a working machine of commerce. But here is the last irony, the one that completes the episode's thesis. The tower's salvation did not come only from office leases. It came from attention, from curiosity, from the human desire to climb, if not to conquer, then at least to witness. The building had been designed to symbolize the power of modern business. Yet one of the most reliable streams of value it discovered was not corporate at all. It was public. People wanted to go up. They wanted the view. They wanted to stand where the city turns into geometry and the streets become lines. They wanted to buy a ticket and make the skyline personal. So the hollow victory fills itself in a way its original architects probably did not imagine as the main act. Tourism, the observation decks, the experience of looking down at New York from the height of its own ambition. The building becomes a product, yes, but also a ritual, a place where the myth can be consumed, not just admired from afar. In a strange reversal, the tower that once struggled to attract tenants becomes a tower that attracts bodies, millions of them, year after year, simply because it exists and because it is still there. And this is where the Empire State Building earns the meaning we now take for granted. Not the meaning of ego, the meaning of persistence. It was born from a contest of powerful men, raised at a pace that demanded risk, opened into emptiness, stained by despair, struck by catastrophe. Yet it kept standing, and it kept adapting. It did not ask to be loved immediately. It waited. It weathered decades. It learned how to turn its own fame into fuel. It became, almost against its own original intention, a kind of democratic monument, not a private palace, not an inaccessible fortress, but a public staircase to a shared view. That is why, when people speak of New York's spirit, they return to this tower so often. Because the city's character is not never getting hurt. New York gets hurt. New York bleeds. New York breaks hearts and gets its own heart broken. The character is something else harder, less poetic, more true. New York gets hit and does not go down. The building's scar from the plane crash becomes part of that legend. Not as spectacle, but as evidence. Evidence that resilience is not an abstract slogan, it is a material property. Steel, concrete, procedure. And the stubborn refusal to let disaster decide the final shape of your story. So, yes, today the Empire State Building is an icon, but the most valuable way to see it is not as a guaranteed triumph. It is as a reminder that icons are often born in contradiction. That a victory can be hollow at first. That greatness can arrive early while meaning arrives late. And that sometimes the thing built from ego survives long enough to be redeemed by the people who simply come to look at it, ordinary people buying tickets, taking photographs, reclaiming the skyline as their own. And now one last turn of the knife, one last hook, because history loves contrast. The Empire State Building is a tower made to be seen, a public exclamation mark. It invites the gaze. It sells the view. It thrives on attention. But just west of Central Park, there is another building whose power comes from the opposite impulse, not to be admired, but to be sealed. Not to be climbed, but to be guarded. A residence built like a fortress of privilege, wrapped in rumor, superstition, wealth, and later, tragedy. A place where the outside world is not welcomed, but kept at bay. Empire State belongs to the crowd. The Dakota belongs to the boundary. And if the Empire State Building is the story of ambition becoming resilience, then the Dakota is the story of privilege becoming paranoia, of a castle that collects legends the way old stone collects shadows,